This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 215 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we are going to give you 17 small tweaks that will dramatically improve how group work works in your classroom. Group work was something I was never really great at as a teacher. It was just something I kind of threw into my plans to mix things up, a way to make my classroom more interactive and sometimes a way to save time. Grading one assignment for 4 students was a lot faster than grading 4 separate assignments. I also genuinely believe that students could learn a lot simply from interacting with their peers on any kind of structured task, even if it wasn't all that optimized for collaboration, because humans learn things from each other all day, every day. Still, I know I could have done a much better job of it. I know that the participation in my students' groups was uneven, that the load probably fell too much on some students more than others, and that there was probably a whole lot of inefficiency, a lot of wasted opportunity. So it makes me excited to be able to share the work of Connie Hamilton with anyone who is teaching right now. Connie is joining me on the podcast for the 3rd time today. The last time she was on, in episode 172, she happened to mention this little trick she uses for giving instructions to groups when they're working. And I thought it was such a smart idea that I told her she should really write a book on group work. So she did. Her book, Hacking Group Work: 11 Ways to Build Student Engagement, Accountability, and Cooperation with Collaborative Teams, was published earlier this year. In it, she offers a ton of practical advice and ideas for making the most of the time you devote to group work in your classroom. To give us a peek at what's inside the book, Connie has written a blog post for Cult of Pedagogy where she shares 17 small tweaks you can make to some of the most common things we do when it comes to planning and managing group activities. And in this episode, she is going to explain every single one of those tweaks. I feel confident that you'll learn at least one thing that will make your groups work just a little better. Before I play my conversation with Connie, I'd like to thank Verizon Innovative Learning HQ for sponsoring this episode. To inspire tomorrow's brightest minds, educators need today's best tools. Introducing Verizon Innovative Learning HQ, an easy-to-use free online portal that empowers K-12 educators to bring new ways of learning into the classroom. The site offers educators hundreds of free, standards-based, ready-to-teach lesson plans, immersive educational experiences, and professional development courses to help educators learn new skills, feel more confident with technology integration, and earn research-backed micro-credentials free. New curricula is available from partners including Discovery Education, McGraw-Hill, and NYU, plus new professional development courses and lesson plans focused on esports and game design. It's all part of Verizon's commitment to help close the digital divide. Start your journey at verizon.com/CP. Support also comes from Everfi. Want to prepare your students for career and life success but short on time? Busy teachers use Everfi's standards-aligned, research-based digital lessons, recently awarded with the ISTE Seal for High-Quality Curriculum, to teach students to thrive in an ever-changing world. Interactive, game-based lessons designed by experienced educators help you engage students at all grade levels and bring critical, real-world skills like financial education, health and wellness, character education, early literacy, and more to your classroom. Thanks to partners, these lessons are free for all K-12 schools and students. With back-to-school season gearing up, now is an exciting time to give your students a jump start on their future. Go to cultofpedagogy.com/everfi, that's EVERFI, to learn more and sign up to get a virtual swag bag full of free goodies to get the school year off to a great start. Now here's my conversation with Connie Hamilton about group work. All right, so I am going to welcome back for, I believe it is the 3rd time now, Connie Hamilton to the podcast. Hi.
Hi.
So, I keep having you come back because you always have such great, workable, actionable ideas for things that people can do to just make their classrooms run better.
Thank you.
So, you have written a new book called Hacking Group Work. So, what we're going to talk about is going to come from that. But can you tell us a little bit about what the book does?
Yeah, sure. At the last time that I was on your podcast, we were doing the esteem conversation. And in that, you said, I'm going to pause just a moment. Like, you need to write a book about group work. And so here we are. You wrote the foreword for me. I'm committed. You
Yes.
made you commit to it right then. So, the previous book that I wrote was on questioning, and as I started working with schools, it seemed that there was a really high interest in how we can pivot and have students doing more of the work, having it more student centered. And I watch a lot of teachers work their hindies off. And I
Yeah,
thought, yeah, this is backwards. We need to have kids working their hindies off. So
right.
that's kind of where it came from. It's a derivative from the hacking questions, and it just goes in more deeply into how to set up groups, how to facilitate groups, and how to maintain the responsibility and the majority of thinking on kids.
Got it. And just before we get into it, tell me a little bit about what your role is right now in education. What kind of things you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
So I was a teacher, a principal, and a curriculum director, and during that, when I was a curriculum director, I worked in a really small school district that didn't have much money. So I did a lot of professional development inside the district.
Mhm.
And I just loved it. It kind of scratched that itch that I lost when I left the classroom.
Yeah.
So now I'm writing and partnering with schools all over. I do some speaking engagements, but most of my days are spent boots on the ground in classrooms with students in session, observing, giving feedback, and working side by side with real teachers, with real kids.
Awesome. So, what we've done, or what you've done, you've got a blog post that we're going to be putting out at the same time that goes into detail about all of this. Is you put together 17 tweaks that teachers can make to the way they approach group work. That if they make these tweaks, things can just go much, much better.
Hmm.
And we've broken them into 6 categories. So we'll discuss the categories as we go. But the first one is the way that the groups are structured, whether they are individual partners, larger groups, or so on. So the first thing that you have seen that teachers do real commonly is that they will say to students, hey, if you want to work with a partner for this, you can, or you can work on your own. They kind of can do it if and when they like. So what would you suggest that teachers do instead? What's the tweak for this one?
So the tweak for this one is being really purposeful with whether or not an activity is intended for students to work independently. Are you gathering assessment data? Are you looking for a dipstick? Is it formative? Are you getting prior knowledge? When kids work in groups and they complete things together, you don't get that. So being purposeful about if you want them to work individually, if it's a small quick thing, if just two people can bounce off of one another, maybe you're trying to get a little engagement activity involved, or if you're really designing an activity where multiple perspectives, multiple thinking all can come in together. So when we just say, hey, you can work with a partner if you want, to me that's sort of more like peer tutoring. If you need help, ask your partner.
Mhm.
It's more of a support system than it is a learning structure.
Okay. And it's a sort of a tell that this is not an intentionally designed kind
Yeah.
of a task. So, number two, and this is still in the group structure area, is letting people choose their partners or groups randomly. And what would the tweak be to that?
So, of course, we want to give students some autonomy, and they love to pick their own partners, and so a little bit of that here and there is nice to sprinkle in. But we really miss a wonderful opportunity to purposefully assign students with a partner for a very specific reason. So you might join two students because they both have the same reading level, and you're going to differentiate a piece of text. And so I know this group is going to read this text, this group is going to read this different text
Hmm.
because of their ability level. It may be that you really want students to be vulnerable. The task is going to be extra challenging. And so in that case, you want to place them with someone they're comfortable with so that they are more willing to take risks and they're not so concerned about the social interactions. And then conversely, conversely, if you're really focusing on social interactions and really building those collaboration skills, you may intentionally put them with people that they don't typically work with. So it's all about what benefit do you want to get out of the partner or the groups, and then how can you organize that?
And you've got a technique called clock partners, which I have seen before, but I never saw it this way, where I had always thought that teachers did clock partners kind of also randomly. But explain for people who don't know what clock partners are, how that is a really easy way to do this intentional grouping.
So if you set up the clock partners, of course, you can have up to 12. A lot of teachers
Hmm.
start with 4. And you can intentionally say, all right, the 12 o'clock partner, that's going to be one where they can pick their own partner. This is going to be like their buddy appointment time.
Hmm.
And then maybe they set up a 3 o'clock partner, and the 3 o'clock partner is based on similar backgrounds or similar interest levels.
Hmm.
And maybe the 6 o'clock partner is their writing buddy. And
Hmm.
so when you are in a moment where you want to pull that clock partner out of the hat and you don't want them to just talk to the person, their elbow partner who's next to them, then the teacher can say, all right, this is going to be best if I have students that are at they have similar math levels, and so that's the 9 o'clock partner. And you say, all right,
Hmm.
everybody grab your 9 o'clock partner, find a place in the room to get settled in, and then we're going to start the task. So kids don't necessarily know that there's purpose. They may appear random to the
Hmm.
students, but it gives a lot of choices for the teacher, and up to 12 different purposes that you can pair kids up.
Yeah. Yeah. So the third approach within this, how we structure our groups, is assigning the same group size to all students. And I definitely remember them doing getting a group of 3 or 4, and you figure out the details later. So, what would you recommend that teachers do instead, like to tweak that?
So just kind of thinking about the individual learners. So, and I was the same as you, Janet. Like, okay, I have 21 students, so I can have 7 groups of 3 and they'll all be the same. But if I want
Hmm.
groups of 4, I'm going to have one left over, and just sort of thinking about what that math is. And instead, maybe looking at the task and the students. Maybe two students are going to work better together if it's just the two of them, and they can
Hmm.
handle additional tasks and responsibilities between the two of them, and they're going to go like lightning speed. Perhaps there's another one where multiple students, you may have English learners that are together. You may want to put them in a group where they can have some dialogue and conversation in their native language and also bringing in English. And so they have a support system, and that might be a reason to have a larger group. So instead of being locked into this activity has to have 3, just ask the question, does it really have to be 3?
Hmm.
Or is there another consideration that should be made when deciding what students are working with whom?
Yeah. I'm thinking about something like Jigsaw, where you'll have, the content will be divided into a specific number. And in that case, would you, if you have more students than chunks, would you just pair students up? If you've got, say, a new English learner, would that person just be like a buddy with somebody who has a chunk? Would it be done
Hmm.
that way?
Yes, and when you do the jigsaw, when you have that expert group,
Hmm.
that that expert group really can be any size,
Yeah.
because if you have 6 students who are studying the same part of the expert group, you can have a group of 6, you can have 2 groups of 3, you can have a 4 and a 2. It doesn't matter because they're all focusing on the same content.
Hmm.
The important thing about the jigsaw is that you have a formative assessment after the expert group before they go into the teaching group, to make sure that they're actually prepared to share what they were
Yeah.
becoming experts on.
Yeah. Okay, so that was our first section on group structure, how we actually structure the group. The next one is how we give directions to our students. You've seen a lot of things in just, and this is your strength, I think, is these small little things that make a huge difference. So the first approach that you wanted to talk about was that when teachers have a set of instructions for the activity, a lot of us will start by reading the instructions to the, I'm picturing myself, I would hand them out or
Mhm.
have them open the screen, I guess now would be the case, and then I would go through and read them and make sure that they understand it. So
Mhm.
what would be your approach instead?
And the caveat to that too is who wants to read the directions? And they call on
Yes.
one student to read the
Yeah.
directions,
Yeah.
expecting the other 24 to be listening and committing it to memory.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, listening to someone else is not the best way to put information into our memory. And so, when we read the directions, number one, we're saying we are now the beacon of the information. The directions
Mhm.
are with us. And so, without even saying so, it suggests that if I forget the directions, my go to is the person who communicated the directions. So, instead of reading the directions to them or even calling on one student, have everybody read the directions. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, read over the directions. And then love to see, all right, tell your elbow partner what are the three steps that you're going to do,
Mhm.
or activate them in which step do you think is going to be the longest, or what
Mm.
materials are you going to need in order to complete this. So if you ask any kind of follow-up question that requires them to interpret the directions and really think about it, then they'll be way more likely to remember them.
Got it. All right. Number 5, giving multiple steps in a row. What is the tweak that we can do to change
Goes
that?
back a little bit to memory, right? Like
Okay.
we know that we can only hold so much in our working memory. So if you say to students, these are the four things that you need to do. First, you're going to do this, and then if you have time at the end, you can. And then
Mhm.
45 minutes later, they're like, what are we supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
It's not because they're being defiant. Their memories are just short term memory is wiped clean when we shift into something different. So if we put multiple steps in the short term memory and then we shift to the task, those steps are wiped clean
Mhm.
and they don't go back into our memory for retrieval. So a better option is to post those steps and have everybody, point at it or choral response. Where can you find the directions if you get stuck, so that what we're putting in their memory is where can you find the information? And that's a
Mm.
easy. You have a visual, you have a kinesthetic. If they're pointing, you have lots of
Mhm.
different senses that are coming in to help them to remember that. And then, kind of tying into the previous one, if they get stuck on what do we do next, the beacon of information is no longer the teacher. Now it is wherever the directions are posted.
Mm.
And so it will be more encouraging to have them independently solve that problem.
Mhm. And the next one is actually key to making that work. 'Cause the next common approach is the teacher answering questions from students about the task. What would so kids are working and then they, I have a question, I have a question. You sort of run around and do that. So what would you recommend instead? What's the tweak?
So if you set it up as we were just describing, here are the directions,
Hmm.
this is where you find it, then you just come back with a follow-up question. Where can you get that information? And
Hmm.
so it's the challenging part. When I say it, it sounds so ridiculously simple and obvious,
Mm.
right? But the
Mm.
challenge is that when teachers are teaching and they're in the classroom, their brains are thinking about so many different things that sometimes we are not cognitively considering what's happening when a student says, what do we do after this? We just want to solve their problem so that they can keep moving and they don't have a
Yeah.
delay. And so we just feed it to them without really being reflective about what that is communicating to them about their level of independence or
Hmm.
dependence in this
Hmm.
case.
And you're actually in this post, and so people should go over and look at it. You've got a chart of actually some suggested things. So, like when the student says, we finished A and B, what do we do next? Your reply would be,
Where might you look to review the next steps?
yes, which is it takes a lot of self-control from the teacher
Mhm.
because you could probably more quickly just answer the question, but you're
Right.
ultimately giving yourself more work in the long term.
You're right. I would say this, that there are probably a handful of teachers who can feel their blood pressure go up a little bit when
Yeah.
somebody asks the directions. And so if you feel that bubble inside you, instead of having like, well, what did I say? Because that
Yeah.
still is about me, right? Or
Yeah.
how many times do I have to repeat the directions? Or you should know
Right.
that. Just use that kind of fire as a cue that this is a time that I can pass that responsibility back onto the student so that they're the ones who are like, gosh, where can I get that information? Oh, yeah. on the anchor chart or wherever
Right.
it is.
And you make also a very important point in this item about tone of voice
Mm. Hmm.
and how important it is to not be sarcastic. And I think this would get more and more challenging the more the day goes on, the more often you've been asked the same question.
Hmm.
So, talk a little bit about that.
Yes, because it does seem sort of rhetorical. So I can say, well, where might you look to get those next steps?
Mm-hmm.
Where should you be looking?
Mm,
Or that, so that's more of looking at a behavioral that's going to solicit an emotion. What we want to solicit is a cognitive thought. And so we pose the question more as a scaffold that you might ask, like, well, what's a strategy you could use? So we
mm-hmm.
use that same tone that we would use in a content area. We use the same tone for how they are activating responsibility. Well, where might you look for to review the next steps? Where was
Yeah.
that information? Gosh,
Right.
just kind of having that mental thought.
Right, because we don't want our kids to feel humiliated and embarrassed, but I can see in a classroom where a teacher gets really good at this, where the students would ultimately end up answering each other's questions where
Hmm.
they'd say, "Let me go ask her." And they're like, "She's just gonna tell you, she's just gonna ask you to go look for a resource that would help you." So, it can be a very positive thing. And I think this really is a built-in part of our curricula that is not written down anywhere. But if we don't see this as, ugh, I don't feel like taking an extra 30 seconds or whatever to calm myself down and say and redirect them. They should know this, but this is part of what we're teaching them. This
Hmm.
is part of socializing them to be, good citizens, is learning how to help themselves.
Some teachers that struggle with that, I give them just a broken record response so that they don't have to think about it so much. And
Yeah.
so that might be just like, that's a good question. Someone else, I might wonder that too, and just kind
Yeah.
of just let it simmer.
Right.
Like, oh, I
Right.
asked a good question. I didn't get an answer. Guess I'm on my own.
Okay, so that was the first six. We talked about structuring the group, giving directions, and now we're going to get into assigning roles, which is a really common thing in group work. We, put students in groups, and then a lot of teachers will give them um, roles to do. So we're on number 7 now. And the issue we're talking about here is that teachers commonly will not differentiate between partners or group members. We'll just put them in a group and then they just have a task. So, what
Yes.
would you recommend for teachers who don't assign any group roles that they
Right.
start with?
If they're like, work together.
Yeah, that was me. I mean, that was
Yeah.
me. And I would wonder every time, why is this not going that well?
Well, and inevitably, right, one person carries a larger load than the
Mm-hmm.
rest, and then that's
Mm-hmm.
frustrating too. So the first thing is just to assign labels, even if they don't have specific roles, but just to assign labels so that you can assign tasks. So if there are partners, you have an A partner and a B partner. Some
Mm-hmm.
teachers use, peanut butter and jelly or whatever, ham and cheese, I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and then that way you can equalize who's doing the talking, who has the task. I don't need 24 students to come get supplies. So B partner, you get supplies. Well, C partner, you clear off the desk. Or,
Mm-hmm.
so we're just
Mm-hmm.
giving them maybe some tasks, which we'll talk about later. But the
Mm-hmm.
first thing is just to label them so that you can quickly give some assignments or tasks as needed.
Right. Okay. And so then, if we are going to be giving more complex roles to students, um, the next common thing that you've seen a lot of times in the classrooms that you're in is that teachers will assign them, but they don't give them any sort of practice or models. And this also was me when I did this type of thing. I would tell them what they had to do and
Mhm.
then not understand why they weren't doing it
You're the
well.
questioner, so you need to ask questions to your group, or you're the
Yes.
summarizer, right?
Right.
So this is just like we think schools that work with PBIS,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how they identify the expected behavior, and then we model what the expected behavior looks like, and then we communicate also what the non-behavior would look like. And so
Mm.
this mini lesson of looking at what is a questioner, what is a summarizer, what is um, a vocabulary person, whatever task that they happen to have that's an academic role, we want to introduce kind of one at a time. So if you're not doing this at all, you don't have to have all 4 kids in the group have a task. You can just begin with one. Everyone's going to have this specific role. We're going to support one
Mm.
another.
Mm-hmm.
So then once we have that single role, then the next time we add another one, and now we have two different roles. So
Right.
we give a little mini lesson, we share what it looks like, we communicate what it doesn't look like. Like the questioner is not going to ask rhetorical questions. They're probably not going to answer their own questions. They're not going to ask simple, basic, foundation level questions. So we also just want to communicate the quality of that role as well.
Yeah. And so now I'm trying to picture like how would I do that? I'm thinking would it be appropriate to do just like a little skit of somebody sort of doing it in an effective way and then maybe
Mhm.
someone doing it in some ineffective ways?
Yeah, so any even a fishbowl, so if you
Right.
know that a student is doing that, you say, "Hey, will you model this with me?" You bring in a student and then you play one of the roles. Or if you
Okay.
see a group that is just naturally performing a role very well,
Mhm.
then have students observe that. You don't want to have students modeling the negative behaviors or what not to do. Those are things
Okay.
you're going to communicate or you're going to model, like, and then
Okay.
circle around and say, "Why won't you be doing this?" So
Right.
that's
Okay.
just an
Okay.
invitation to be wildly silly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the ninth one is giving only housekeeping roles to some students. Let's talk about that.
So yes, I remember back in the day where there were kind of some staple roles. Like you have the
Hmm.
timekeeper, you have the reporter, the recorder, and the materials manager.
Hmm.
And so I think that's great. Like once teachers are beginning to think about everyone needs to make a contribution to the group, then you're halfway there. So the next layer is, what kind of contribution are they making? So are they just making a housekeeping type of contribution? And are they going to look at their task like, okay, yep, everybody has a paper and pencil. I'm done. My job's done because I'm the materials manager.
Right.
So the tweak there is to make sure that everyone has some type of academic or cognitive role that contributes to the learning, not just the preparation. So,
Hmm.
of course, they can have housekeeping skills, or excuse me, roles on top of that. So I might be the questioner and the person who's responsible for watching the time.
Got
But
it.
my sole job is not to watch the time.
Got it. Great. Okay, so that is assigning roles. We are now on the section about how we support students' learning during this process. Um, the next common approach, number 10, is we call chasing hands. And I know exactly what that is. I used to think of them as baby birds, of just the little beaks opening all over the
Uh-huh.
nest. And I was just trying to feed them. So this is kind of connected to the earlier one about not answering all the questions about instructions, but this has more to do with supporting learning. So instead of chasing hands and answering all their questions about the learning, what should we be doing instead?
So providing the materials, that everything that they need. So this is less about the directions and really
Hmm.
more about what kind of what tools might they need, what additional texts might they need or resources, but to make sure that they either have everything that they need or they have access to what they need, and then a system for accessing additional resources or whatnot. So I often talk about being invisible. It's a chapter in, actually, in both of the questioning book and in the hacking group work book. It's the only chapter that's repeated, because I just went into a little more detail. I really
Mm.
feel like the bulk of the work around group work is done in the planning stages. And so
Mm.
when you spend so much time planning something for group work, and then you come around and answer every question and provide little supports and help here and there when they could be doing it for themselves,
Hmm.
what is lost is the actual role that the teacher is supposed to be playing, which we'll talk about, I think, in number 12. So
Hmm.
we,
Hmm.
we really want to make sure that teachers have a benefit while students are learning from each other. And yeah, we're not going to let them struggle to the point of frustration,
Hmm.
but enough struggle is exactly what we're trying to achieve. We're not trying to avoid struggle. We're trying
Right.
to make struggle effective. And that's a
Mm.
different lens. When we try to completely eliminate struggle, and I always say the harder it is to learn, the harder it is to forget. And
Yeah.
the easier it is to learn, the easier it is to forget. This is why we learn from failure, because that's hard. And
Right.
so we are not trying to make things easier for students.
Right.
You know, a side note before I get on my soapbox too much is this is especially true for students with disabilities that are included in gen ed classrooms. We tend to make things so easy for
Mm.
them
Mhm.
that they don't remember it because we basically spoon fed and held their hand through it.
Right.
It is a little trickier to find that sweet spot of struggle and still allow them to be successful, but sometimes we just grease the slide and down they go.
Right, right. No, that's such a good point too, because collaboration is one of those 21st century skills that
Mhm,
we've been told now for a while. This really is something that we need to be doing with our students, and yet I don't know how much any teacher has been handed sort of curriculum for doing that. And all the stuff you're talking about is that it's giving them an opportunity to do some problem solving with their peers. And the thing is, and I just want to encourage teachers who are listening, there may be times when you go too far in that direction and maybe it doesn't go well because you've let your kids struggle maybe for a little bit too long, and that's not wasted time
mhm.
necessarily. That's
Right.
you found where the boundary is and now you can kind of
Exactly.
pull back a little bit, and it's probably better to have that than to always make things so easy for them that they really just don't ever develop those interpersonal skills or those problem solving skills.
I was talking to someone the other day and he was telling me about his daughter, and when she was little, that she's now grown, she's 23, and when she was little, she was very independent and she would say, "I do myself." And
Yeah.
she wanted to do everything herself even when it was hard. And I think about that often in the classroom, like students do want to be successful,
Yeah.
and there's a much greater sense of achievement when you can be successful on your own.
Right. And I also think that it's important to let kids know what we're doing when we're doing that, because if we skip that and
Mm,
we just sit back and go, oh, I don't know, go ahead, fail, like, and they never understand, like, I'm trying to teach you to problem solve, then they might just be like, I don't know, we just do this weird group work where we never get any instructions and no one ever helps us and we don't know what we're doing and no one ever gets anything accomplished. Like, I think they need to know there's a method to this madness. There's a
mhm.
reason. And if it doesn't go well, let's talk about it. Let's, troubleshoot. You guys give me some feedback and let's, and make it a collaborative effort between the teacher and the students also to sort of fine tune this.
Sure, because when you
Um,
don't rush in to save them, to the
mhm.
student, especially the older they get, because they are accustomed to teachers helping
Right.
them so quickly. So if they
Hmm.
come to a teacher who delays that or allows them to struggle for a little bit longer than what they're accustomed to, that feels like my teacher won't help me.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
that's a real by not communicating what you're doing and why you're doing
Right.
it, that's a great way to have a parent waiting for you tomorrow morning when you get to school.
You're absolutely right. And a lot of times I think my own kids will come home and say things like that. And I always think there has got to be more to this story.
Mhm.
But, you just, and I do think there's a lot of times when teachers don't want to pull the curtain back and say, this is what's going on, or maybe they don't feel confident enough about it. And yeah, and I think it's especially true also with like your gifted and advanced kids who are used to getting straight A's are like, no, tell me how to do it and tell me how to do it right. And
Mhm.
they can have the parents who will definitely be on the doorstep the next day.
For sure.
So, okay, so the next one is a little bit the same, but it's a little bit different. And this would be allowing individual students to come to you with questions during group work.
Mhm.
What's the issue with that and what's the tweak for it?
So the issue is that when students come to a problem or a question before with whatever task it is that they're doing, when they feel like they need help, their go-to is to shoot their hand up in the air and get help.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so we want to change their default from seeking the teacher to tapping into the resources that they have. So if an individual student has a question, we want to make sure that all of the group members have
Mhm.
exhausted their resources and they have all put their cognitive energy into solving this problem or answering this question, and they haven't been able to with sufficient effort. And then that's when the teacher will come in. So I often model this in the workshops, because there's, when you get there, you don't know which it is. You know, you see one
Mm.
hand in the air and you don't know. So if you sense that this student is taking the lead and is posing the question, assuming that nobody else can answer it either but hasn't bothered to check, then the action is to listen to the student, but don't make eye contact with the student. Instead, model what you want the student to do, which is, when the question is being asked, look at all of the other group members. And
Mm.
eventually, they will also be looking at those other group members. If you see someone in the group that's kind of itching, or they start to wiggle a little bit and you can see that they have something to say, then you invite them to come into the conversation. So,
Okay.
"Oh, Jen, you look like you have some thoughts about that. Why don't you
Mm.
share?" And then
Mhm.
as soon as that learner begins and you have the least bit of inkling that, yes, they're on the right track, then that's when you get up and leave. Don't
Mm.
wait for that person to finish, because as soon as they do, the entire group is going to whip their head over at you and look for some sort of affirmation.
Mm. Mhm.
So we want to get out of there so that the affirmation comes from the group, not from the student.
Yeah.
And then the other one is, if they really do have a hiccup, then you might offer them, what resources have you tried, and what other ones are available. And sometimes it might be you just forgot. You forgot to
Right.
add a detail, and you recognize, like, oh yeah, I forgot you're going to need this sheet, or you're going to need post-it notes or whatever. And so let me go get that, Nance. Here you go. Now move on.
Yeah. As you're talking, especially that last scenario where someone starts to talk and then you just disappear, it makes me think that I was talking earlier about these little skits that you could do to model the students' roles. It almost seems like you could do that too with, like, here's something you're going to see me do.
Love that.
And when I walk away, that's not me abandoning you. That is me saying, you guys have got this.
Mhm.
And I want you to continue to rely on each other, again, to further the accurate interpretation of your behavior, because that drops everybody's cortisol levels down. Everybody, as opposed to, like, why is she being such a jerk? She just keeps walking away. There's so much subtlety in all of this in terms of
Yeah,
things going well or not. So I think even that deserves, like, a little bit of preloading so that they understand what's happening when it's happening, and they'll
sure.
have more trust in themselves.
And if you forget to do that preload, then just give them a thumbs up, a smile, an
Yeah.
okay sign, like something just a little nonverbal that's like, "You got it. I'm good. I'm happy.
Yes.
You're proud. You don't need me anymore. I'm out."
Yes. So then the next one in this section is reteaching concepts during the group work rather than systematically scaffolding for students. So what's going on there? What's the tweak?
So, this applies in group work, and it also applies in individual work as well. When
Mhm.
students are struggling and you recognize that they've exhausted the resources or the knowledge that they have, then almost always our go-to is to reteach the lesson quickly, or to try to trigger their memory, like, "Well, do you remember when yesterday when I was doing that such and such, and then so and so had this question?" And we try to cause them to remember the lesson by triggering it.
Mm.
So what we want, though, is for them to be going to look for it so that they can recall it and retrieve it.
Mhm.
Retrieval is different than recognition. So
Mhm.
when you remind somebody of something, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, now I remember."
Right.
That is not the same. It's not it doesn't even practice, "Let me try to remember." Right? So
Mm.
you've been to a good restaurant, you want to make a recommendation for the restaurant. Your friend's like, "Hey, what's the name of that restaurant?" You're like, I can't remember. I can't remember." And 4 seconds later, you're whipping out your phone looking up the name of the restaurant,
Mhm.
as opposed to trying to create those grooves in your brain that
Yeah.
allows for that quick retrieval to come back and forth. I know you have some really awesome blogs on retrieval.
On retrieval practice, and
Mhm.
we've never really gotten into this moment that you're describing, though, when it's just a conversation or the act of answering questions for students spontaneously.
Mhm.
that is also an opportunity for retrieval practice. And I never thought about that, but it's so true.
Mhm.
So yeah. And again, if we have taught kids the concept of retrieval practice, then you can say, I could give you the answer, or I could have you try to retrieve it yourself, and you're
Mhm.
going to remember it better if you
Yeah,
do that.
exactly.
So sorry, I have no answer for you. So then what you're doing instead is prompting them instead of
Mhm.
just giving them the answer.
Right. So the prompt, all you're basically doing is kind of lighting a fire in their brain without giving hints.
Mm-hmm.
So those prompts turn into things like, well, what's a strategy you could use? Where have you seen something like this before? What have you tried? And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's very
Mm-hmm.
telling because you might say, what have you tried so far? And it might be nothing.
Yeah. I was just
But
going
if
to ask
they've
you.
tried 5 different things, that's also telling.
Yeah.
So what we before we jump into giving a quick little mini lesson to repeat it because we think they forgot it,
Mm-hmm.
just do a quick little search to see if maybe it is in their brain, they're just struggling to retrieve it, and we just wanna give them some prompts to go looking
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. All righty. We are up to number 13, and this is a new section now. This is about what is the teacher's primary role in when group work is going on. So the thing that you commonly see teachers do, this is number 13, is spending their time answering questions and helping during the group work session. We're walking around tending to everybody. What do you think we should be doing instead?
The teacher's primary role during collaboration time is to collect data, observe, take notes, formatively assess, and just soak in that learning. You know,
Mm,
one of the things that always comes up is grading, and I have had so many conversations with teachers to say they'll say to me, "I know they can do it. I saw that they can, but they just
mm,
don't do it." And I'm like, "If you know they can do it and you saw that they can, isn't that enough?
mm. Wasn't that formative assessment right
Isn't
there?
that
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
evidence that you observed it? You don't have to have a tangible item that you can put a letter grade on in
Yeah.
order to identify a learner as having mastered a skill or a concept. If you have evidence, then you have evidence.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
getting over that hump is just, I don't know why it is so challenging, but teachers are experts in their field and they know how to recognize mastery. And
Yeah.
for whatever reason, they feel like they have to have students give some sort of really structured output,
Yeah.
and when they are using the group work time to run around and answer questions and interject in the groups, how are you doing so far?
Mhm.
When they do all those things, they aren't free to just gather data to say, okay, this student has it with help from their partner. This group has gone beyond.
Mm.
It frees you to do all of that, which now think of all the time that you save grading papers because you
Mhm.
just do it in
Mhm.
the moment when it's authentic.
You're so full of gems, Connie Hamilton. Oh my gosh. No, because now I'm realizing too, yes, that's a way that we can actually treat that. And the thing is, this answers the other question, which is so many times people want to give students a participation grade
Mm,
for group work. And really, we should be looking for evidence of learning instead of just saying, are you participating equally with everybody else? And so it kind of solves both issues.
mhm,
So number 14 is related that a lot of teachers you see just checking in, going from group to group and just,
mhm.
hey, want to check in, see how everything's going. What should we be doing instead and what's wrong with that?
So thinking about what that actually does in student conversation. So students are having conversation, they're moving forward toward learning their task, and then you come in and say, "So, how's it going?" What that
Mm,
effectively does is it completely halts the progress that they are making. It
mhm,
stops their progress, and then they literally have to go backwards and
yeah.
repeat what they have done up to there. So to kind of put this in edu terms, when we look at the gradual release of responsibility, which is commonly known as the I do, we do, you do,
Mhm,
we have the you do together and you do independently that we get from Fisher Fry. We, the collaborative learning is the you do together component. The minute
mm,
a teacher comes in and interacts with learners it
Mm,
immediately, by definition, goes to we do. And
yeah.
so if you don't intentionally desire to shift that release of responsibility from you do together, if there isn't a reason to shift it to we do, then don't. And
Mm,
that's what we are unaware that we're doing many
got it.
times.
Got it.
So just don't interrupt. Keep your distance. Be close enough that you can see and hear what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I often recommend that you don't address the group like with facing the group. I wish your
Mm.
people could see me now because I'm turning my body sideways.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, instead of facing the group, just kind of turn your body maybe a 45 or 90 degrees to the
Mm-hmm.
side so
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't look like you're inviting yourself into them, but you're kind of turning your ear to them so you can see them a little bit more, but not becoming part of the group.
Got it. Got
So
it.
a lot of it is just sort of what are the nonverbal communicators that invite yourself into conversations. I was just this week, I was in a classroom and it was just that literally every single time the teacher came around to the groups, they anticipated that she was going to have conversations. So even when she didn't want to have a conversation, she got sucked into it because the students pulled her in because that's what they were
Mm.
expecting.
Mm.
We want the expectation to be the opposite. So if a teacher does interject, that's a rarity during collaborative learning.
Mm. Mm-hmm. It almost sounds like the ultimate goal would be that you could literally leave the room for 20 minutes and everybody would keep going
Yeah.
really productively. And
Hmm.
yeah. Okay, so we are now at the final section. These are the last three. And this section is about the actual learning tasks that
Hmm.
we design and assign for these collaborative projects. So, number 15 is this is what we commonly see, grading one project or assignment for all group members. So, take a group grade
Hmm.
for an assignment. Super common. And
Right.
it's meant to be a way of cutting down on our grading. So, what's the problem with this, and what would you recommend instead?
Well, our standards and our goal is that each and every individual learner masters the learning target or the purpose for learning. And
Hmm.
so when you assign a goal, or excuse me, a group grade, whether it's averaged, if you take the highest, it doesn't matter. I've seen it done a bajillion different
Yeah.
ways. Um, what you're doing is you're grading the journey, you're grading the learning. It's like offering, if you're a lecture teacher, or if back in the day when we had more lecturing, it would be
Hmm.
like grading students during the lecture. Like that's
Mm.
we don't do that. And so the collaborative learning, we have to think about that as the method for learning, and then the assessment of learning occurs individually. So we
Okay.
use the group in order to gain information, to deepen information, but every individual learner is still responsible for walking away learning what they were supposed to learn.
Mm. So, what
So,
my first thought when I hear this, though, is I'm thinking, so all these teachers that are assigning a group project where the group gets together over a series of weeks to work on like some final presentation that they give to the class, or would we just not be doing those?
no, you could still do those, but the assessment then becomes, can everyone speak to the project? Can everyone speak to? And so
Okay.
it isn't about, we're not grading the project.
Got it.
We are assessing the individual learning that is the outcome of engaging in the project. The
Okay.
project is the method. It's the means.
Okay.
It isn't the end. It's the means. And
Okay.
so because I did this project, this is what I learned.
So
Not
if
this is the right. The project isn't the evidence of learning necessarily.
that's interesting. So if this is a group of students, let's say they investigated some sort of like an environmental problem that we have, and they
Hmm.
had to present like these are our statistics. This is the solution that we think. Maybe the assessment then at the end is like an extended response that each student writes about their problem and what.
Hmm.
And so can you actually talk it through alone without your group members there to
Hmm.
feed it
You
to you?
might
Okay.
even use whatever tool that was created as a talking
Mm,
point and talk
mm,
from that. Like, hey, we did this and this is what we learned, and then we did this and that is what we learned. And so
interesting.
it's another kind of going back to what is the teacher doing during collaborative learning. You
Mm-hmm.
If we're not chasing hands and answering a bunch of questions, we can
Mm-hmm.
systematically have many interviews with students each
Mhm.
and every student to make sure
Mm.
that they all are walking away with a level of understanding for the purpose and not riding the coattails of someone else. And again, it
Okay, so
doesn't have to be a written response, but it does have to
right.
be each individual kid.
Yeah. Okay, then this is what teachers are going to say next, though. If
Hmm.
I'm not giving them a grade on this PowerPoint presentation that they all stand up and give and their big poster, they're not going to do it.
So the grade in if you're doing a present, well, if you're giving a grade for a presentation, then
Yeah.
that seems as though now what we're assessing is speaking and listening skills.
Uh huh.
And so certainly you're going to assess speaking and listening skills when they're speaking and listening. And so
Okay.
now you have an opportunity to assess those ELA standards that are speaking and
Mm-hmm.
listening.
Mm-hmm.
And then the content still becomes individual.
So it's just a way of thinking about this in a different way. If there's like a PowerPoint presentation, maybe each student ends up designing their own slide and that's what they individually get graded on or something like that.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, if that is
Okay.
the evidence of their learning,
Right. It depends on your
you
subject area. If you're
then
a
you
science
mhm,
teacher, you're not necessarily giving grades for a well-designed PowerPoint. It's did they learn the
right.
science?
Sure. It
Got it.
but what I think here's the thing is there like a this is thou shalt do it this way doesn't exist in
Mm.
education. And
Mhm.
so it may be even the same teacher with the same students, they may look at it differently depending on how students are interacting. So if as they're roaming around and observing different types of learners, it seems as though they have that each student has contributed to that end result,
Mhm.
and they can speak to the other roles that
Mhm.
they did not have. What
Mhm.
happens is the same problem as with jigsaw, right? If I do my thing
Mm.
and you do your thing and our other partner does their thing, we have only evidence of 1/3 of the learning, but yet we get a grade for 100% of the learning. So
Yeah.
you have to look at how the task is designed to see, is that task evidence of the whole 100% of what they were supposed to learn, or is it piecemealed? And if it's piecemealed, then maybe you use it for if there are three checkpoints or three single point rubrics,
Mhm.
then you may look at one. Learner A is going to be assessed on part A, learner B is going to be assessed on part B, learner C is going to be assessed on part C, and then the follow up is on the two parts that you weren't assessed on in the project itself.
Mhm. Mhm. Number 16 is grouping students for simple tasks. So explain what you mean by that and then what would be your tweak be?
So sometimes students, especially now, I hear teachers all the time. I think the first line of the book is a quote that I saw on Twitter where a teacher was said that group work felt like putting pretzel salt in her students' eyes. They just didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that contributes to that, besides the social interactions and the awkwardness and coming out of COVID and all of
Yeah.
those things,
Mhm.
one of the other components that contributes to that is that they don't see the benefit. I could
Mhm.
do this by myself. I don't need to do it with someone else. And
Right.
so when we design tasks that require collaboration or open thinking, broaden thinking to different perspectives, so I can think about it a new way or I can create an argument for a perspective that I didn't originally have, that's when the value of group work becomes obvious and to students. Otherwise, it's I can do it by myself. This is going to slow me down. Or, yeah, I'd rather work with a group because then I can get it done faster. But the
Mm.
reasoning and the value around the group work isn't that it deepens my understanding or it contributes to the learning.
So, can you give me like an example of what that would look like? And I know I'm asking you this, we didn't really prepare this, but I'm trying to picture like we could even do like in a science class. Like what would a task look like where everybody is really really needs to be group work as opposed to just dividing labor?
Well, if you, so can I give you a different example that's at the top of my
Yeah.
mind? I was
Yes.
just in a government class this week,
Okay.
and the students were talking about the six different forms of government, and the
Okay.
teacher was asking them which one is the most uniting. and
Mm.
which one has the least amount of stability. And
Mm-hmm.
the learners had different perspectives, and the teacher said there isn't a right answer, there's just
Yeah.
right defense for that. And so in that case, it is less about this is my task and it's more about this is my perspective. And then the
Mm-hmm.
conversation becomes, I was listening to these two girls who were talking about it. And by the time their conversation was done, they had both convinced the other to switch to the other's point of view. And they were arguing against themselves and supporting
Wow.
the other person's perspective. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is jackpot right here.
Yeah.
So that type of task, sure, you could have each individual learner do it on their own, and then they would think they have the right answer and the
Mm-hmm.
single perspective. But when you invite them to hear a different view, it
Mm-hmm.
broadens the way that they think about unity. So, for example, one of the girls said that a dictatorship is unity because they're all miserable together and they're
That's funny.
united in
Yeah.
their misery.
Yes.
So I'm kind of laughing about this, but it's a perspective, and it deepens your understanding, or at least poses the question of, well, what does unity actually mean?
Right.
And that's
Okay.
exactly what she wanted to do.
Yeah. So scenarios where just hearing different perspectives. So if we're talking about literature, we're talking about sort of social issues or whatever, that's one. I'm also thinking
Mhm.
any kind of like a problem solving task. Like I see those
Mhm.
like popsicle stick type thing where just other people can be contributing ideas that you may not have thought
Mhm.
of. So brainstorming types of things
Yes.
or
And in
okay.
science, if they're not following an experiment that's step by step, do this, do this, do this, where the
Mhm.
outcome is planned in advance, if they have some autonomy to play around with the variables within the experiment, then
Mhm.
that's where that conversation, like how much water, we're going to add water to this. How much water do you think
Mm.
we should add? What happened? Well, what if we put a drop? Well, I don't know. I think we should put whatever. That
Mhm.
that just the opportunity to talk about some of those decisions helps to get a more definitive action or decision made on the individual versus
Yeah.
like I don't really know what to do, so I'm going to try this, versus let
Right.
me bounce it off of someone and see what they think, and then we can agree where we're going to begin together.
Yeah. Yeah. So we are now at number 17, and I love this one. So the common approach you see is that the feedback that teachers give to students in group work is based solely on content.
Mhm.
And you recommend what tweak for that?
I recommend using that noticing that you have when you're invisible, when you're not chasing hands, to use that time to also observe and look to see how students are using soft skills, their collaborative learning skills. So, are they paraphrasing? Are they sharing the floor? Are they inviting one another to communicate their thoughts? What is it that they're doing that makes their group effective? And then be sure to give feedback on that. And one way to encourage students to really hone in on some of those specific soft skills is just to tell them, hey, when I'm walking around and I'm jotting down notes, yeah, I want to know what you are learning about landforms, but what I really want to see today is I want to make sure that every single person is invited to share their thoughts. So
Mm,
what should you do if someone in your group hasn't shared their thoughts? What are two things you could do? And
yeah.
you just give them, you front load, if this problem happens, what can you do about it? Rather than noticing the problem while you're roaming around, you're going to be tempted to interject and say, oh, I haven't heard from partner C. Why don't you ask
Mhm.
them to speak? You front load
Mhm.
it. So now they're using recall, which is the lowest level of blooms, to
Mhm.
remember what it is that they're supposed to do when someone's not contributing, or one member is particularly quiet, and they have a couple of strategies they can use. So we want them to look at those speaking, listening, collaborative, soft skills, and give feedback so that they can get better. Too many times we either think our kids are too young to have those skills, some teacher in the future will teach that. And then
Mm.
you move to the future and it's like, my kids can't do this. I don't know why somebody in the past hadn't done it. And
Right.
then
Yeah.
nobody really hones in on how can we really perfect and sharpen these skills that employers want desperately.
Yeah. So, Connie, you have so much other stuff that people can learn from. And so, where first of all, I want to let people know. Usually, at a blog post or an interview like this, if we have a list, I'll typically review it at the end. But there's too many here to do that with, so I will just tell people to go to Cult of Pedagogy, go to this blog post of yours. We've got graphics that summarize this stuff and everything, and it's episode 215. So, where can people go to learn more from you online?
Probably the easiest way would just be on my website, conniehamilton.org. Don't go to .com. That's a realtor in the Midwest somewhere. So conniehamilton.org, and there you can send an email or whatnot. There are a bunch of free resources, including a download for Clock Partners is on that website too. So everything there's free.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jen.
To read Connie's full blog post and get a link to her book, Hacking Group Work, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 215. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.